it's something we definitely try to talk about, is just like think for a moment about like what could you be learning, vice versa. Obviously the more you're talking, the less you're learning, type of thing.
My guest today is Nicholas Thorne, general partner at PreHype and co-founder at Audos. Wikipedia calls PreHype a venture development firm, but Nicholas puts it simply. They're in the business of helping people figure out what company to start next. And based on their track record, I'd say they're pretty good at it. PreHype has helped launch some very successful companies, including BarkBox, Every, and For Them. What's really impressive about Nicholas and his team is that they are builders themselves, not armchair quarterbacks. And his latest venture shows just that. He recently co-founded Audos, an AI co-pilot that will help you launch a company from your smartphone. If that sounds too good to be true, just DM audos.ai on Instagram and see for yourself why thousands of people have already used them to start real businesses. In this episode, we talk about how to get a company off the ground, why you should be testing multiple ideas rather than just one, how action creates information, what founders should know about how VCs think, and a lot more.
You have this illustrious list of companies you've incubated, Every, BarkBox, there's like 50 others. How many hours a day do you spend in a cold plunge?
You can't. Hopefully, I'm not that cliche.
No.
I've actually, my cold plunging is de minimis. I do like to jump in like a super cold pond, but I don't do any proper cold plunging. You?
No.
How many hours a day do you spend in a cold plunge?
I wish I had like 3 minutes, but no, it's kind of like a meme in the office because I get a lot of Huberman in my feed, and so I was like, oh, like this cold plunging thing, like that's pretty cool. Like I would get one.
Yes.
But it's kind of a sore spot because the HOA in my building won't let me have a cold plunge. I asked.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing where it's like I don't want to violate the HOA rules on that, and
no,
then
definitely not.
Learn that the structural integrity of the balcony wasn't what I thought.
Yeah. And cause a big problem.
And so anyway, I'd been like coming into the office talking about, because I would had all the Huberman stats, like total fanboy, and I'm like dopamine, like brain power or whatever. And then Alex just comes in one day. He's like, I ordered one. And Alex got a cold plunge like 90 days ago or 6 months ago. And he like, I swear to God, it's just like turned him into Terminator. It's kind of hilarious. I'm like seeing he like flipped the switch, and then he's like, we had all of our family, or not all of our family, but some of our family was in San Juan last week. And Alex had the cold plunge at like 35 degrees or whatever. It's like overclocked, as cold as it'll go, and everyone's like like sheepishly getting into this cold plunge and like kind of like dipping a toe. He just like jumps in, goes underwater, and stays underwater for like 30 seconds. We're all like, is that safe? Like, is he gonna die? Like, is he okay?
Oh.
Yeah, so
that's impressive.
That's Alex.
My version of that is my friend group and I got somewhere, one of those things, maybe it was a Huberman thing, talked about how long can you hold your breath. And so then everyone is like doing the contest and trying to post their stats which is very difficult to audit, of course, among a bunch of high school buddies.
And dangerous.
Yeah, it is a little dangerous. It's the type of thing where you're like in there, you're kind of like, should we really be doing this? It feels like a bunch of high school numbskulls doing something they shouldn't be doing.
Don't do it underwater.
Yeah.
I had a friend who was doing that.
Wim Hof. You ever seen the Wim Hof method?
Yeah. You can go pretty, like, it's crazy when you do that. Like, even as
you see the movie about or the Netflix about the free diving record holder. It's a woman from Italy.
No.
I mean, it's the scariest no horror film has ever been scarier than the first 5 minutes of this, where they, among other things, they do this, whatever you call the part of the movie that sometimes runs before they even show the opening credits. They track this person going down hundreds of feet. They're grabbing a line to pull themselves down deeper and deeper and deeper. No apparatus, no assistance. And they do this epic thing on Netflix where they just have their heartbeat going, and like the audio is just their heartbeat, which of course gets slower and slower and slower until it stops. Crazy. And then they turn around and you can kind of like see the panic in their face. Yeah. I honestly had to turn it off. I couldn't. It gave me. You knew they were.
Oh my God.
It was crazy. But
that's
anyway,
insane.
I don't know what it's called, but it's
like because I've understood that the free divers, they're like there's no sort of warning. They just like if they get it wrong, they just all of a sudden they're just unconscious. And it's just
my impression from watching a bit of this. Yeah, and they have people who try to help them, and this movie, something very tragic happens to the partner of the of the record holder under some version of, I think he was saving her from that. Anyway, it's a very sad story, but
dark.
Yeah.
So on that note. So how would you like the entrepreneur in residence role, assuming in sort of a good place, not the underpaid associate? What is that, and how would you describe it, and what's the difference between that and being a founder?
Yeah. I think at different places it means different things. So what I can answer pretty clearly is what it has tended to mean for us over the years, which is it's, first of all, that those two things are probably not particularly distinct.
Right.
They're kind of running in parallel. I think when you do it at a big venture firm, you're in that role because they're paying you, and they need to have like something, and they need to have some. You want to have some title, and that's why then you see people with executive in residence, or you're just in residence. So how about we just call it a resident? Because that would, by the way, from our perspective, more closely describe an analogous thing. When you think of a resident in a hospital, you think of someone who is basically doing some combination of learning on the job. And I think probably, with the intention that, let's just say they're going to go into private practice, that eventually they go off into private practice. So I think it probably looks fairly similar. Like if you're in EIR in most places, you're kind of studying, you tend to be studying like markets and customers and the various laws of physics, and combined with the kind of arts of how do you, start something and what do you want to start next, and you're trying to kind of steep yourself in that topic. And so I think that would look a bit like wandering the halls of the hospital, walking into different cases and learning about them, whatever. And similarly, I think in most cases you're probably spending some amount of time in and around the existing portfolio of the organization that you're in residence with. And so you're, maybe plopping in to help out with something because you presumably have some skill set that you can maybe make available. And that's certainly been core to, however we've worked over the years, is that it's very common that if someone's in residence, in whatever format we want to call that, it wouldn't be surprising at all for them to spend a month, 2 months, 3 months doing some work for one of the companies that we started a year ago or something, because that gets them kind of engaged in the texture. And I think a big part of it, and I assume this is pretty general, is if you sit down and you get like a blank piece of paper, you're like, I'm going to start a company today. I don't care how disciplined you are. Like, you won't fill the day with that job,
right?
Because you'll write like a list of things, and you'll have to go do things. And you use this great phrase, like I would love to accelerate the tuition on the learnings of doing this podcast, and so I'm going to do as much of it as I can as soon as possible. Well, like, let's assume that one of the things you're doing when you're starting a company is like you're just doing things with the goal of creating information with which you can then make a new decision, right? Yeah. Well, that information doesn't always like come back instantaneously. In fact, I think some of the information that comes back instantaneously, you probably should be a little bit distrustful of, right? Like, it's like the information you can get immediately is like whatever you can Google, or I guess now you can, ask ChatGPT about. But like, okay, well, that's probably information that everybody has. So you then are making a decision, are you a better like judge of that information than the person next to you? I think that's a very risky thing. If you go do something, and this is Brian Armstrong, the Coinbase founder, talks a lot about this, or at least I've heard him talk about it, but action creates information. So you got to go do something to create some unique piece of information with which to make a decision. Most of whatever we have ever done, and certainly what we've tried to encode in Audos, is a bias towards do something so that you can create information, hopefully about the customer, like have some interaction with your customer. Basically anything. Like it almost doesn't matter. Just do something that elicits a response from the customer, and then react to that, and then figure out what you do about that.
Yeah, there's this great quote that I heard. I can't remember where I heard this quote, but it's something that I think a lot about often. I definitely tell our team, it's like it's easier to steer a moving boat. Like you can't steer. You just,
I think that's very well said.
Boat standing still, you can't steer it. So,
I heard a version of this. There's an entrepreneur named Patrick Drahi who owns a bunch of cable television businesses in Europe. He basically ran the John Malone cable television playbook in Europe like a decade or two after John Malone ran it here. And he then bought Sotheby's, the auction house. And my wife was working there at the time. And so I think it was on YouTube at some point, like listened to a town hall he did after he acquired Sotheby's. So you have this like cable television and internet and, like pipe entrepreneur and CEO and billionaire who buys this like luxury asset. And so I think everyone's a little bit like, who is this guy? And
right.
Other than that he speaks French, like what is his claim to luxury? But they got on to talking about how you like work, and he said this just amazing thing, and I'll butcher what exactly, but the message was, they were like, what do you want us to all take from this meeting? And he's like, the only thing I want you to do is the next time you're in a meeting, just make a decision instead of waiting 30 days to make the decision. Because the extra benefit of the 30 days is incremental. The benefit of using the 30 days to react to whatever you learn from the decision that you choose is invaluable. And I think it's just, by the way, it's very difficult. Like, it is hard to live life that way. It is hard to operate that way.
Making those fast decisions.
You just realize how often it's there's always a good reason to
deliberate.
Yeah, just like, we could do this one extra thing.
Right.
And by the way, sometimes that is true. And the reason it's difficult is because sometimes you're right. Whatever the analogy is, like your first version probably does suck. So maybe do a second version, but probably don't do a 10th version. And where that fine line is very challenging. But you got to be creating third-party information, especially in these kind of the lonely business of entrepreneurship, where you can get in your head and deselect everything eventually based on, realizing that there's some reason why the thing that you think should exist doesn't yet exist.
Do you have any, now having done this as long as you've done it, do you have any, I hate to say tricks, but plays that you run or something in the early days to get that information faster? I think back to like when I joined Opiscope, and I was like, what do I need to do, Alex, to come build this thing with you? He's like, figure out sales.
Yeah.
Like, I'd been a derivatives
You're
trader.
like,
I didn't know anything about sales,
Yeah.
Like, planted my ass in a chair and just sent cold emails for the first 9 months. And like,
sending cold emails is a pretty good way to start.
But it took so long to start getting those signals, it was like 9 months to close the first deal. And so I'm curious, like, what would you have done, or is there anything you'd think about to get, because we sent a lot of cold emails where there's just no response. They're just going into the ether, right?
Yeah. Well, first is like, go to autos.com and get started. No. I think a lot of it is behavioral. I think one of the parts I'd say is that there's a peer pressure dynamic to that. And so this is a place where I think having some sort of co-founder or co-founder-like person, which is the role that we've often played for people, is so valuable, which is it's very easy on your own to say, well, like, I'm going to send those cold emails tomorrow because I'm going to work today on, working on those things.
I'm going to write the copy.
Exactly. But if you've got someone next to you who's, it's a little bit like, it's just good peer pressure, right? It's just like, you don't really want to be the person who says, oh, well, like, whatever. And it's often easier when you're not the person in the seat of whatever that core function is to recognize when someone's doing that and just be like, well, why don't you send like 2 today?
Yeah.
You could do that, couldn't you? And they're like, oh yeah, I could send 2 today.
Yeah, one's better than 0.
Yeah, whatever, right? And so I think it's a place where, we've often tried very hard to just be the person sitting in that seat. Like, do we really have to wait for that? Yeah. Because like, why don't we just try that tomorrow or today or now? Like, how about we use this time now? I'm amazed by, and this is partially a personal comment, I definitely have the bad habit of procrastinating things. And the only trick I've ever figured out there is like, if you're on a call with someone and you say, I've tried to catch myself. If I'm like, oh, I'll do that, like, oh yeah, sure, I'll send you an email. Yeah. It's like, no, like, let's just do this literally right now. It'll take 30 seconds. Like, just hold on. Yeah. So I don't know, but it's exhausting, I think, to like function like that. Yeah. To just constantly be like, oh no, we could probably figure out a version of this. We could.
Exhausting for you or the people around you?
All the above. I think everybody. Yeah. I think it's the human nature part of it is to just kind of wait a step or
take a breath.
Whatever. But I think that's where I was looking at Henry Ford, I think, says something like, there's nothing's particularly difficult if you break it into small jobs or whatever. Right. Obviously, that's the marketing slogan of the assembly line. Sure. But I think it's pretty true. Like atomizing your work and slicing it into very thin jobs. If there's something that you feel you need to do, certainly at the entrepreneurial level, which is the only job that I have any, have studied at least, there's never a reason. If the bias should be, if I can't do that today, not when can I do it, but what version of it can I do today? So instead of taking the task and saying, oh, well, therefore I can get that whole task done by the end of the week or by the end of the month or by the end of the thing. Instead of thinking about that, well, why don't we just cut that job into smaller pieces so that you know what it is you are doing today? And I think this is it's a whole nother, I would argue that this tends to be a hallmark of a resourceful person. I'm very interested in, and Henrik and I spend a lot of time chatting about entrepreneurial resourcefulness. And it's this kind of quality that I think you can develop and you can train, and everyone can train in themselves. And I think this is a big part of the conversation about what it means to be resourceful. But one of the ways I think about it is like, if you got to the end of the week with one of your employees and you gave them, and they said, how did I do this week? And you said, well, you were very productive. Well, you can kind of like imagine in your mind what that means. Like, they did the things on their to-do list pretty well. If you had another employee and they got to the end of the week and you're like, and they said, how did I do today? And you said, well, you were very resourceful this week. It doesn't necessarily mean that they like got all their, stuff done.
Right.
It probably means that, first of all, they came up with some things they added to the list. They like looked at the to-do list and they were like, well, those 50% of things I think we can jettison, but we'll do these and then we'll add these things because these are more important. And maybe they made some like system for how to like keep doing those things without having to invest more time. Or there's these like certain criteria of what we could all imagine resourcefulness to be. But one of them is, in the face of the thing not getting done, you do it.
That's interesting. It's, that apart from figuring out how to start a podcast, one of the things that I'm probably the most important thing that I'm trying to figure out now is like recruiting and hiring. And I'm curious with that, kind of what you were just saying about resourcefulness and kind of bias to action. I think I know the answer, but like, if someone comes knocking on your door at PreHype and they want in, what are the qualities that you're looking for in that person? And then I have a follow-up.
Yeah. I think the main, and we feel the same, maybe it's a crutch, but I think we feel the same way about, it's the advice we give you about when you're thinking about a business idea. So like a version of that thought process, I've got a bunch of different ideas for companies I could start. Which one should I start? What qualities should I look for in the businesses? And our attitude is like, well, can you start all of them in some, not maybe, can you do something for all of the ideas that you have some real emotional connection to? And so that you can gain some information,
right.
And by the way, like trying to, from the start, like pick which of the things might be the right one, I think is just really difficult to do. So
you mean when an entrepreneur has like
got
10
like
ideas,
5 ideas, picking the one. I mean, sometimes you can say like that one's
objectively better.
Objectively, that tends to just be like it's not very well defined. Okay. But like if you define them all, if you could come out in a place where they're all defined at the same level of resolution and along the same parameters, my answer would generally be like, just try something across all of them so that you get some information, including which one do you enjoy spending the most time on? Because let's assume that this is just going to require like a ton of personal commitment and whatever. Well, then like the sooner you know which of these customers you enjoy serving or which of these solutions you enjoy working on or whatever, the sooner you'll be able to know which one might you be willing to like put the extra degree of effort into. But anyway, so if you apply a similar thought process to people knocking on the door and saying, I want in, our attitude is, well, let's just find something to work on. And we have over the years, attempted to, maybe that's not like, the only way to do it, but a big part of it has been, can we find some, can we create some surface area for collaboration? Because interviewing someone or talking to them and trying to come up with like what qualities do they have or not, at least in my personal experience, is just really difficult.
Right.
And so I'd rather come up with some way to work on something together.
Some kind of like
sort
practical
of project.
assessment
or like,
project.
Or like, we have this portfolio company that needs help, like, and you seem to have the following experience, so you might be relevant to helping them. Like, let's go spend a cycle working on that. And it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be some time, and we'll pay you or whatever. And so, but can we come up with some way to get to know each other better? Because also it's a two-way street. Like, how does that person find out that when they say they want in, that they really want in? Like they don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like. And so I think, all of those things are part of how we try to just create opportunity for shared learning and exposure so that we can then make it, decide if we're all into things. That being said, once you do that, what comes through that is, generally I'd say that like entrepreneurial people are agitated. They don't really like sit there waiting for an answer. They like they demonstrate this quality that we're talking about.
Right.
Like they do stuff. They
probably some impatience.
Yeah, there's a bit of impatience. There's a bit of just kind of like willingness to try, willingness. And very rarely do you hear the words, well, I've never done this before.
Right.
So I got to, do you know how to do that? Well, that's like that sentence, which we all hear a lot. It's like, oh, well, like I've never done that before. So I got to think about that. And it's like, actually, that would be fine. I've never done that before. I've got to think about that as like something you might hear.
Yeah.
I've never done that before. Do you have any resources? Like that's a direct, that's a real red flag.
Did you always have that attitude? Like when you're talking about this, like, positive peer pressure and exactly that, what you're talking about, like just sort of like find the way to yes. Like, do you have a sports background or anything? I'm curious.
I mean, I played a lot of sports as a kid, but not in any formal,
Okay.
or not at any level of. I'm by far the least accomplished athlete in my family. Maybe is an easy way, and nothing particularly distinguished about my family's athleticism. So.
Okay, I was wondering, you're like pretty tall, and you're talking about all this
tall.
stuff. It's like, and I have, because I had a cycling background, so I have a lot of and competed in that, and I have a lot of friends that are professional cyclists, and like a lot of what you're describing are often like the soft skills or qualities that seem really common in athletes.
Well, I would say that I think that like, athlete is not a bad word for what in the form factor of like someone who does a lot of things well but not perfectly. I think you see a lot of that in kind of entrepreneurship, and I think you'll see a lot of problem solving is just a version of like not feeling overwhelmed by a task, and I think athletes often in like finding calm amidst like competition, et cetera, has a similar dynamic of someone who's not overwhelmed by the moment, not whatever. And I think versions of entrepreneurs you see are people who they just have an attitude of like, we can do it. We can figure this out. We can spend the time. Like there is a way, there is a path, at least until proven otherwise. And I think that's common to that, probably in some way, that attitude of we can win, or it's possible. Like I can imagine myself winning this thing.
Yeah.
Is similar to, I can imagine finding a way through this problem that I'm thinking through.
That makes sense. I'm curious that it's like, I really like this idea of sort of like there's always not to put words in your mouth, but I think you would agree, like there's always some minimal next step that you could do, right? Like, and the answer is not like, oh, I need funding or I need this or I need that. Like you can move the ball forward in some way.
I agree with that. And it's, by the way, one of the reasons why up until a moment where you're very clear with yourself of what the one thing is you want to spend time on, it's another reason why I would argue for entrepreneurial people, it's not a bad thing to have a couple things going.
A couple different ideas?
A couple of ideas that you're mulling over.
Yeah.
And that's because if you take the view that there's always something more you can do, there's always, you can push the ball forward a little bit, well then, and then look at 1 month of that activity, well, you will therefore make progress. Right. Definitionally, there's almost no chance that you will arrive at the end of that month and not have made kind of on an absolute basis progress.
Right.
So the question is not, did I make progress this month, and therefore should I keep going or not? Because then you will always end up in the conversation of yes, I should. The question is, did I make enough progress? Well, that's really hard to judge on like without some point of comparison. And so one of the benefits of having at least something that you're thinking about, even if casually as some sort of kind of mental thing, or that you're actually making a bit of progress on, talking to some other customers, what have you, is that you, I think you get a much more relative framework with which to ask the question, which did I make enough progress?
By doing the small chunking, you mean?
Well, no, I think the small chunking means you will always make progress.
Right.
So then the derivative of that, though, is that like, if you are therefore judging, is something worth doing based on did I make enough? Like one of the ways in which you might think about, oh, well, is this a business I should keep working on? Is, am I making enough progress?
Right.
Is the progress fast enough? Is this going fast enough? Because that speaks to kind of slope and it speaks to momentum. And these are the things that you have to be kind of judging to decide, like, is this something I want to spend the next chapter on, a month, a year, whatever the period of time is that you might commit. Should I leave my job to do this? Should I raise capital to do this? Should I? These are decisions that you make based on, how much momentum are you generating? So, but those two things become in conflict, because if you can always make a little bit of progress, by definition, if you just slice them down, you'll always be making progress. If you don't have a point of comparison, it's then very hard to make the analysis of, did I make enough progress on this idea this month? Whereas if you have two things, at least you arrive and you've made progress on both of them, and you might think you're dividing your attention. So I could have been making more progress on this one thing, but what you've opened up to yourself is that when you get to the end of a period of time and you look back and you try to like judge the slopes, you have two lines to look at, and you can much more easily decide which one of these things is going faster.
It's a lot better to do a sort of like forward test in real life rather than just, that's interesting, because I feel like when you hear people talk about being an entrepreneur or starting a company, there's this almost like glorification of ridiculous conviction, which obviously works in some cases, but they'll point to like Mark Zuckerberg or like whatever, and obviously these are the outlier among the outliers among the outliers.
And I also, what I would say to that is they often come right after a period of promiscuity, idea promiscuity. Like,
what do you mean by that?
Well, that like the reason that the conviction and the unbelievable whatever is probably actually another hallmark of an entrepreneur, is that there's a degree of stubbornness, I think, in a lot of folks. Like that, by definition, like we don't live in a perfectly efficient market, but we live in a world where, like, if there's a really good idea, it's probably been tried in some capacity. So you have to kind of believe, in a slightly stubborn way, that you are right about something that other people are wrong about in order to try anything like truly new, right?
And then you probably need to be careful to make sure you're not just like the donkey pushing the boulder up the hill.
Exactly right. And so you have this like willingness towards this thing. So up until a moment where a set of signals have been put in place that certainly convinces you of this fact, I think it's the disciplined thing to do, to your point, to like, to have a point of reference. And if your point of reference is other people in your Y Combinator class, I don't know, I'm making it up, or you have some mentor who you really trust to be able to like look at what you're doing and give you like objective feedback, and you're going to listen to them. One way in which you can kind of have that check and balance on yourself is to be disciplined about just be moving one other thing along for a period of time along in parallel, because then when the moment comes where one of them is, you can much more easily then if you spend 30 days working on two things, of course what anybody would say is, oh, well, your attention was divided. You could have made more progress on number one if you had spent all 30 days just on that. Well, you and I have already established that like the information generated by action doesn't always come immediately. So you might find yourself in a place where like you spend a day doing something that creates information, but it takes a day for that information to arrive. Well, so what do you do on that day? Do you just like sit there and stare at your thumbs, or do you do something else? But if you go back and forth in these things, you get to the end of 30 days, I think you'll often find that therefore you'll be able to judge your own personal emotional connection to something. Like, do I just enjoy one of these things more than the other? Is one of these just easier? Like, you're looking for a kind of suction from the market. Is the sense I'm getting of the suction stronger over here than over here? And I just think that's a very hard thing to do on an absolute basis if you only have one thing with which to make that judgment. But then, when you feel there's that suction, I think where you see unbelievable, commitment, whatever, that doesn't mean if there's suction that it's easy. Like, you're still gonna have to run through
a lot of brick walls,
and that's then I think when you often see that kind of unbelievable focus and dedication.
How would you? I think a lot of what you just said is interesting because it's really quite helpful. So to someone that is maybe in more like building in isolation, someone that's not in a PreHype type environment or doesn't have peers in these ways, right? Because that's something you can do on your own. And I'm curious if there's any specific suggestions that come to them. Obviously, like what you guys are doing is you have this community and that's its own thing. Like, what would you say to someone that if someone wrote you an email or whatever and they're building it on their own in Nebraska in their bedroom, to kind of create this sort of these additional data points, because I think that's kind of what it is.
Well, I think it's all the more reason why that becomes important, for sure. I would say email people like me, because more often than not, I think, you find that people are pretty receptive to picking up the proverbial phone and talking about that and checking back in. And
just start your email with, "I was so impressed by your background."
Yeah, exactly.
That got me a long way when I was in college.
Yeah, that is I wonder what like the how quickly people catch on to the cold email starters, and like what becomes avant-garde, versus tired.
I was talking to a family friend the other day who wanted some kind of career advice. And I was like, well, I don't know if I can give you career advice, but I can give you advice on how to like reach people. And I feel like one underrated thing, and then I'm, now I'm like derailing this. I'll let you answer the question, but it's crazy when you're young, when you're like 18, 19, 20, 21, how much time people who are really high in their career will just give you if you just come to them on the basis of asking for advice. Someone, this is going to be like the episode of anecdotes and quotes, but it was like someone told me, or I read, I can't remember, it was like, if you ask for a favor, you'll get advice. If you ask for advice, you'll get a favor. Yeah. And that was probably the biggest like accelerator to my career when I was in college, because I went to this tiny little school in Southwest Colorado that no one's ever heard of. And I just emailed all these people all day long, like, because I wanted to be an investment banker at the time. So I'd email these like MDs and all this. And I was blown away by how many people would talk to me. Yeah. If I did that same thing now, I feel I would probably get a fraction of the responses, because they'd be like, oh, well, you're already, you're 10 years out of school. You should have figured it out already.
Nothing worse than it's, I mean, to the point, like, action creates information. Like, the cost of doing that is de minimis. The value of getting one person to respond is enormous. And that doesn't mean you like spam everyone you can find. Like, obviously there is some quality, standard above which, you have to, or below which you won't have any result at all. Right. But I 100% don't understand, if you want to get an answer, why not just send the email and try it? And if it's you and you've, like, it's authentic and whatever, the world is full of stories. I mean, you could build a podcast compilation of how many people, will just talk about the unbelievable doors that have been opened for them by
just from sending
some sort of cold outreach.
Yeah, authors too. Like, I found that like New York Times bestselling authors will often reply to emails like so fast you wouldn't believe it. Yeah, because they're like, oh yeah, you read my book, that's awesome.
Yeah, like, oh, you're the one.
Yeah. It's interesting with everything you've been saying. I was listening to an interview that you did actually with Kylo for them. And they were talking, and I'm gonna mess up the details, so correct me. But I think they were talking about, in the early days of For Them, they came into, I think they said they went into Heinrich's office and they needed $25K to do something, and I think the response was, well, what can you do with $5K instead? And I'm curious how that, if I got those details right, how much of that
at least apocryphally, yeah.
Okay, how much of that sort of approach or response is rooted in like disciplined capital allocation, and how much of it is more in the fact that, or kind of what we're talking about, right? You give the $25K, then it's like this bigger thing that you're going to go, and you might be throwing kind of good money after bad and chasing this thing where, you know what I'm saying? Like, is the concern the money, or is it more about the time being spent on the idea? And when you constrain it, then it's like you can only do so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think resource constraints, back to the resourcefulness point, are like, everywhere. Right. And so, generally speaking, just better to figure out how to operate with resource constraints. I think in that particular case, it's just a byproduct of some of the business model things we talked about. Like, we don't have a lot of money floating around, and it's not money that we get paid to invest. One of the incentives of someone who's managing capital is to deploy that capital. That's how you get to charge, fees and potentially earn carry. And so there's a bias towards writing checks. Obviously, you don't want to write too many or in the wrong places, but you want to write the check. Right. That's not our model. Our model is not that. So probably the baseline there is just like an availability of resources perspective. But yes, I think it also reflects. It is not remotely surprising to me that one would have a conversation with Henrik or whoever hanging around our hoop, and if I need X, it's like, well, that would be almost like the mental model being expressed through that form factor. Well, like, what about, what can we do to get going with less? What can we learn with less? To your point, do we really need to do that whole thing, or is there some part of it that we could do? Sometimes the answer is we need to do the whole thing, and sometimes you got to have the conviction to say, like, no, I really think without all these things coming together in this way, that it's doesn't represent a fully formed, kind of version of the experiment and whatever, and then that's a matter of, are you convincing enough and maybe it shifts your where are you resourceful to like, are you resourceful in how you aggregate those resources?
Right.
But yes, it's not surprising to me that I don't perfectly remember that story, but like, I think it's certainly as a way of working and a way of thinking, something that is pretty core to some of the mantras that we would spend a lot of time on.
It's interesting with all the kind of what we've talked about so far, because Audos makes a lot of sense now. And I'm wondering when did you're kind of, that was your business? Like you created that? Was that your idea, or how did that come about?
Yeah, we got access to GPT-3 in the fall of 2020.
Yeah. And
if you imagine that a lot of the earliest work that we would ever spend some time with someone doing is things like, okay, well let's write down a few of your ideas. Okay, you and I sit down and you're like, I want to start a podcast company. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, like, let's define what that is. And so we, at least had over time, tried to create these formats for how do you even line up a bunch of ideas on the same, like how do you define what you have to have some almost like Mad Lib, template of how in under like a tweet can you describe different business ideas so that you can look at them next to each other. So like the core.
This was like an exercise.
This is something we would spend time. Yeah, okay. Exactly. And so at the time it's probably in like a Notion page.
Sure.
It's like, who's the customer? So we would have a format. It's like for fill in the blank customer who wants to such and such, something that explains the kind of their ambitions or what they desire. It sucks that fill in the blank problem statement. The solution is such and such. And so that, so for dog parents who want to treat their dog like a member of their own family, it sucks that the stuff available at the local pet store is designed for everyone. And there's no personality and is brown and beige and shitty.
Yeah.
The solution is BarkBox, a monthly, box of toys and treats delivered to your door and on a monthly theme. I'm butchering the thing. If you go through that for anything, at least you are defining who's your customer, what do they want, what's stopping them from getting it, and how are you, like, high level planning to solve.
You have these distinct inputs
and so
to the
now
model.
You have these things, and so it was very easy. Like it didn't take a lot of like looking at GPT-3 to be like, well, what could it like do for us? So we had a version. We called that object at the time an Inkling. Like that was an Inkling for a business. Was something that you could define. If you could write those little inputs, then you had an Inkling. So we'd have these Inklings, and they'd be lined up next to each other. And so then the question. So then we made a thing called like Inkling roulette, I think we call it, but it was really an Inkling slot machine. And so it's like, what happens if you just like, hit the button to generate a new customer and then a new desire and a new problem and a new solution. And if you just spun the thing, and then you'd come up with a new thing. And that was like the first thing that we did with GPT-3. GPT-3 was like cool, but like it just wasn't, so your eyes were open to this was possible. You could certainly generate text and quickly and easily and for free. And so we started to like mess with that, and we just slowly but surely were working more and more and more with those tools to figure out what parts of this early entrepreneurial journey can you take from being things that someone has to sit down and do to being things that are at least a draft is done. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how do you, and it will sound, I think, consistent with a lot of the things we've talked about, like how do you put yourself in edit mode, not in creation mode. Creation being almost always like very tiring, and in this early stages, the more you can like remove exhaustion from the like emotional, intellectual exhaustion from what you're doing, the more likely it is that you can just find that little bit of progress, find some action you can take and get in front of some customer and get some feedback, and then that starts to be energizing. But there's a bunch of work you tend to have to do prior to that moment that is just, I guess like tiring, and it tends to be the difference often between trying something and not. And so we were just kind of this view of like, if you could have a draft done with very little input, more often than not have the machine guess at like, well, is this the problem? No, that's not the problem. The problem is X. Oh, okay, great. But like that's an easier form factor for most people to think in. That you could just start to like, it's kind of trite, but like, the generative AI in our business is generating like momentum. It's just generating the early little, steps that need to get done in order to make progress. But, and so, Audos has been this thing that we've just been slowly but surely making to initially just to serve our own entrepreneur, so that rather than give you a Notion template that was blank, well, wouldn't it be better if you had something you could kind of talk to, tell it your ideas, and then it would at least like fill that document out for you, for example. That's probably was like the V0 of this thing, and it wasn't called that at the time, and we weren't selling it to anybody and all these things. But it's been, a number of years in reality in the making, but all kind of like building towards just, same thing. Take every little step of this process that has to get done and try to just see, can you have a machine, at least propose the content more often than not.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty impressive. I mean, I'd for anyone that isn't familiar with Audos, I'd love to hear kind of the elevator pitch, but it was kind of crazy sort of IRL example. Yesterday I was interviewing Kylo for the podcast, like I said, and they were telling me about this sort of AI thing that they're working on. And I was like, so how did you go about doing that? How did you make that?
Yeah.
You're not a computer scientist, to my knowledge.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, Audos. Yeah. So it's not as a kind of built to like lead into your description. Yeah. It's not this sort of elementary thing. Like, Kylo is a seasoned operator, right? Yeah. And they're there using it. So I'm, how do you describe it when someone?
Yeah, and it doesn't require that, importantly, but I think it's something that a lot of people will find interesting because it asks some very specific questions. It proposes some very specific kind of answers to those questions, and then it starts to like just do stuff. And it's a little bit putting you in this framework of like, if you just keep responding, it'll for quite a while keep doing stuff that is just inching you ever closer to putting something in front of a customer that you had not put in front of them yesterday, type of thing. Getting some sort of customer feedback, and preferably feedback from a stranger who fits your customer profile. And so the elevator pitch, I mean, Audos is a kind of family of AI co-pilots for entrepreneurs. It is, you interact with it initially and primarily in Instagram, of all things. And so you DM with our Instagram account and it responds to you. And the first thing it does is it asks you to name the customer you'd like to serve, and you can make up the name of someone if you don't have that person readily in mind, but we can come back to like why we think that's an interesting starting point. And then the first thing it attempts to do in chat is kind of frame up your Inkling back to that thing. So figure out what is this customer wants, what's stopping them from getting it, and it proposes a number of solutions in order to kind of in conversation arrive at like a version of that form factor. It then very quickly moves on to say, okay, well, give me a second. I'm going to go make some slides. And it generates a 14 or 15 slide presentation in which it attempts to kind of like take the Inkling and flesh it out and think about it and play it back to you as the entrepreneur. And this is really designed as like the human readable version of what we call a customer delight plan, but of a business plan. It's something that at least tries to, with the Inkling as the starting point, think about, okay, well, like what's the context, what's the macro context in which this customer problem exists? What really is that problem, and how could we dissect it across a couple of different dimensions so that we really understand it well? What then is the solution? And it will send off some agents to design a logo, and it's a starting point, and it picks some typography so that it has a bit of brand feel, and pick a color palette and apply that color palette everywhere. And then it moves on to that presentation, at least moves on to talk about the solution, talk about, kind of go through a user journey of how might this person be kind of, onboarded to this system, what would be the kind of moment of delight for them, and then through to what are therefore the benefits of the solution, how much might someone pay for it. It does a bit of Google searching to find how many people are out there that fit this profile, and therefore if you take like the price point assumption multiplied by that number of people, how big roughly is this opportunity, and then down to like what's like a to-do list of things that we might be able to do to make a bit of progress. The person is then asked, like, okay, what do you think of that effectively? More often than not, they're like, well, it's a cool start, but like I've got some fixes to it. And so then they get given a little web interface where they can go in and they can play with the logo and the name and these things, and then they can rewrite the elevator pitch, because the reality is that the whole deck is really kind of summarized by 12 sentences, which are basically the headers for each of the slides, effectively.
And does this come from like a framework or playbook
that
you
guys
have figured out
done
over the years?
That fits the exact framework that we would have ever worked on ourselves, and we for a long time have run a consulting business where we helped the Fortune 500 come up with new business ideas, and this was in large part the way that we worked through framing those up. And that's really just, and we do all that for free, and we do it because that's how the AI can ingest the information sufficiently so as to be able to actually like make progress and have a conversation about this idea. It's like we almost view it as like until a moment where you've gone back and forth with it on that plan and on like the key inputs, most importantly to that plan, like you haven't even been able to describe a business idea sufficiently to figure out what to do about it, right? I mean, like if you and I just sat down and had a conversation, you say, I've got this idea for this podcast. Well, like I'd have to ask you 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 questions about, like how did you even arrive at this?
Sure.
How do you think about, that solution, and like where could you take it? And that's really just me trying to like map out this thing so I can even have a view of what that is. And so that's really what we're doing up until that moment. And then the thing will do 2 things. One is it will give you a link where you can take an interview as if you are the customer. And so in many cases, the entrepreneur could be the potential customer because they're starting this business based on some problem they've observed in their own life, and they have the problem, and so they're trying to solve that problem. And so that's easy. In other cases, we ask them to take it from the perspective of the customer so that we can just go in more depth about. Obviously, we've basically gotten 3 pieces of input from the entrepreneur at this point about what the customer problem is. Like we need more. And so we have an AI that talks to you, or you can type with it, and you fill out this customer interview. And if you want to, you can take this little link that we've given you and you can send it to a couple of other people that fit this profile, and the AI will synthesize all the feedback it gets. It'll transcribe that feedback and it'll put it in one place. And so what that's really solving is that most of the time what we've observed is that when someone wants to start something, they do have 2 or 3 people in their life who fit the profile of a potential customer. And so wouldn't it be nice to have like an easy asynchronous, so you don't have to schedule something with someone of your friend who's busy and you don't really want to impose upon them, but they are willing to take some time to give you some of their thoughts. How do we just really easily capture that information as quickly as possible and then synthesize it into kind of like a product roadmap, something that says, here's what was discussed, here's what seemed to be like the key features that would be most interesting. And then the second thing I would do, and this is I think what probably Kylo talked about yesterday with you, is we will then, and this is kind of meta, our AI will make you an AI that you can use to talk to your customers. And so we call that an automate. And your mate is something that, is informed by this conversation that, our co-pilot has had with you. It's been given a version of your business idea. And the goal of it is really to have you have effectively a landing page that instead of just talking, if you like landing pages to date as things that talk, they just write stuff and they talk at you as the customer, and then you can kind of decide whether you want to engage with it. Like what would happen if this was a landing page that could listen and respond? And so if you reimagine a landing page in a very conversational format, that's effectively what we have in our Instagram bot, and that's what we give people in order to talk to their customers. One of the main goals of it, and the reason that it's probably differentiated from a landing page, it also can be trained effectively. It can be given extra skills, and so it can be given tools that it can deploy on behalf of the customers. And so, for example, in our case, that tool is that it can write slides. And so what the AI will continue to do is basically try to figure out what is our co-pilot with you in conversation. We'll try to figure out what is it something that your mate can do for your customer to offer them a benefit, so that the first experience that they have with you is not hey, come tell me all about yourself, and then I'll like let you know when I'm ready to launch, which is like what these waitlist, style landing page would probably traditionally have done, right? Which is fine, but instead, like in our case, it's like let's talk, and then I'll give you these slides, like I'll give you this benefit, and then if you want to keep talking, then we can move on to the things that I, for example, charge money for, if I know how to do those things. But if I haven't figured out how to do those things yet, at least I will have built trust and rapport and maybe just a little bit of relationship with you, and have like made the first investment in the relationship capital of this relationship between you, the entrepreneur, and the customer. And then that's something that we have found over time to be the building block for all sorts of things, including that it's your first distribution channel through which you can then, as you go through the process of developing whatever product or service or solution it is that you want to develop, that you can deliver. And so that's what Kylo had made, is gone through this process and had their own AI that they were going to use to start talking to their customers. And so, that's really a big part of the business that at this moment we're in. And then there's lots of really interesting things that come downstream of that, which is basically like our experience has been that if you as an entrepreneur can go get some people to, talk to, and in this case you can talk to them by way of this AI that you've infused with your own idea and way of talking and tone of voice and ideas and ideas of how to serve that customer, you get these first data points of like, do people kind of like me?
Right.
And do I like them?
Yeah.
And then the downstream of that is, that you're kind of, now you're in default, not going to call it alive because it still requires investment and love, but like now you have a thing and it can talk to your customers and it can try to like serve them. Well, like you're in business kind of, and like by some baseline definition, you are now out there, you are in business, and we then try to help support those folks through capital and network and all the things that we traditionally would have, done. But that's really the place where we've kind of led to, and it's just amazingly exciting. We have this very diverse, I guess I'm going to call it, but because both it is diverse, it's men, it's women, it's old people, young people, geographically diverse. It's all over the world.
Right.
It is. It's racially diverse. It's everything diverse. And most importantly, the ideas and that they are working on and the customers that they want to serve are diverse, which is what's totally exciting to us. Is like if you put up the equivalent of a form and you say, well, like, what customer do you think you'd like to serve? What you're hoping, of course, is that you learn about lots of different, or what certainly, like selfishly, what I was always hoping is like we would learn about lots of different customer types and needs and what their problems are and why that problem exists. And, that's been totally true. I mean, people are working on everything from, I know yesterday I saw someone who helps lawyers find, after a class action lawsuit, find people who deserve to be paid.
Huh.
And I guess there must be something about the lawyer's business model that is,
right,
incentivized to make sure that the payouts get delivered. But a lot of the people who have been the victims of something or whatever,
they have no idea.
They don't know. And so how do you find those people?
Finding people to just, hey, you want some money?
This is the customers, in this case, is a lawyer. And how do they find those people? I mean, like, I have no idea if that's a big market, a big business, whatever. It's not a zero market.
Yeah, it's a business.
And it's just like fascinating to hear someone talk about what the problems with that are, how you go about it, what could technology do to maybe make that easier to find customers or deliver value. I mean, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's so cool on so many levels. I mean, that's something Alex and I have talked about always for years, that, I mean, our business is bootstrapped and we're not in the sort of VC orbit or whatever.
Yeah.
And the thing that's always struck us as interesting is there's often this feeling like if you're going to start a business, it has to be this $1 billion unicorn. And I remember my first exposure to a lot of this stuff, I had an internship in like lower middle market M&A. And like, the blue collar guy that walked in there that had started a janitorial company whose clients were Schlumberger and all these other huge companies, and he's about to go get a $25 million check. Like he's doing just fine. He doesn't think you need to start a $1 billion unicorn.
Yeah.
And so
he owns 100% of it.
Yeah, and
if it sold for $10 million, he would actually get all $10 million of it, and he would feel pretty good about that too.
Exactly. No one would be mad at him for selling it. Well, I mean, presumably. Exactly. But anyway, I think that it's like such a breath of fresh air talking to you about AI, because I think that there's a lot of AI fear out there,
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a few kind of the opposite perspective that like, okay, maybe it's going to go full Skynet and, we're going to all be like slaves to the machine. But I don't think so. I think that on the other hand, it's this incredible equalizer, right? I mean, a couple of years ago, if you wanted to start a business of any kind on the internet and you didn't have any kind of programming prowess or any of these other specific hard skills, it would be like a non-starter. So it's cool how these tools can just make it accessible to really anybody with an idea and a little bit of sort of resourcefulness. Yeah. And if you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious, how many businesses have been started on Audos so far?
Yeah.
And how long have you guys been running it?
We've only been at a version of like Audos being Audos for, really since the beginning of this year.
Okay.
And I don't know that we've like gone public or whatever with what's actually coming through it quite yet. So I'll probably, demur on some of that. But, we have thousands of plans that we see, bare minimum, right? And so like just think about that from my perspective.
Yeah.
I've gone from like a few plans a year to thousands in the first couple months of the year. And then we have, let's call it hundreds of these mates that have been made. And the pipeline of these things is now we're starting to have people, in real numbers who are, have thousands of their own conversations going on. So, the AI that our AI has made them is now conducting, thousands of conversations, and soon tens of thousands. And so that's just fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's like a really profoundly different thing for us to be engaged in. But if the core job has always been, how do we help an entrepreneur start their next business, but therefore the first step of that, to slice that down, is like, collide them with some customers, get them in front of some people, get them talking to some customers. The scale at which we're doing that is, incalculably
like orders
larger,
of magnitude.
That's larger than whatever
crazy.
we did, and that's like, it's just super exciting.
You mentioned the company that is doing this sort of like outreach for people that haven't found these class actions or haven't received their class action payments. Are there any other standouts? I mean, I'd imagine with thousands, how do you even go through them? That was literally a
pitch yesterday.
Yeah.
And so, I'll say it's an interesting part of this business, and a reason I'll like obfuscate a little bit, is that we don't, and maybe we'll get there very soon, where people are like really out there. I think a lot of these things are things, at least, at, let's call it month 4 of doing this, so run your playbook forward, and we've been getting a lot better about what it is that we're actually doing along the way there. But we have a DJ who wants to teach people music production. So if you're getting into DJ but you want to start producing your own music, how do you do that? And so he has a way of doing that, and he's using these tools to kind of like go find these people. And well, that's like a thing that came a couple months ago, and he's just now kind of, I think his stuff has been roughly ready for a while, but like he himself, I mean, entrepreneurially, like sometimes, back to the point, like it takes a lot to like put yourself out that next step. And so I think one of the things we're creating for people is a environment in which they feel safe advancing something without it necessarily yet having been like their thing that they're telling the world that we're doing. And so I don't know when the moment is going to come where we have enough of those move over, but I don't really feel almost like the permission to share a lot about what people are doing, because in some respects, I think a lot of folks are, doing it. I mean, we have a woman in Alabama who's terrific. I mean, I think she's probably 70 plus. She's very into self-organization and organizing your home and your life and your calendar. And she's gone and built like 1,000 followers on Instagram as part of pushing her tooling out to folks. And I say that, I'm drawing my, I'm getting things out of my brain where people have done these things where they start to show themselves as wanting to be promotional about stuff. But I think we live for a number of months with people actually where they're advancing their thing and they're tinkering with it and they're getting a feel for it, and we're putting little bits of pressure on things. And I think we'll continue to get faster and faster with how we deploy tools to help people get over this hump. But there is a component where, and I think it's important that almost like people feel this, where they don't have to have, they can go through these first steps and not immediately like be on our webpage as like, this is a thing. I think it's okay for people to try these things almost in a little bit of anonymity, get some feedback.
Well, it's like you said earlier, like have 10 ideas or whatever.
And like
amount
try
of
a few of them and not yet like say to everyone, this is my thing, and I think that's a part of what actually that cushion and that, kind of force field is something that I think people enjoy about, they are interacting in relative anonymity for a period of time, and their business can go start having conversations with customers without them having to have said to all their friends, like, this is the thing I'm doing next.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or even that I'm trying to do next. And I think that's, at least it resonates with me. Like, I have plenty of business ideas that I'm not going to like tell you even about yet, because I think they feel kind of dumb, and I kind of want the safe space to like try them without yet saying to you like, here's an idea, Max.
Alex and I call it the skunk works. We probably spend like 3. That's probably the best part of our working together. We probably spend 5 hours a week just talking about all these. We'll call them either skunk works or harebrained ideas. And so often I'll get like a text from Alex at 10 o'clock at night. I'll be like, I got a harebrained idea. Remind me when I come in tomorrow. And it's like everything from how we're going to start a San Juan cold plunge company to like.
I mean, that seems like a winner.
Yeah. I hope this isn't too much of a hard pivot in the conversation, but.
We're into pivots.
Yeah, I was trying to, we're getting close to out of time, and I had a couple things I wanted to ask you, because when I Slacked you and asked if you'd do this podcast with me, I had a specific question, and so for a little bit of context,
Yeah.
you obviously have this like incredible background of helping these companies from really like early stage get traction and get up and running, and helping people understand like what do you need to do to get to that next stage. And I had been talking to someone who I respect very much, and they're actually working on starting a venture studio. It was in this case, and so I thought, given PreHype is in this position where you're, as you pointed out, you guys are not a VC, but I don't know, would you call it VC adjacent, or I'm sure there's some kind of in the orbit.
Yeah.
I had, as part of the prep for this show, and what I was kind of trying to do is just ask smart people who I respect, like, what are you trying to learn about?
Yeah.
And so I messaged you because he basically told me that the things he was trying to learn about were, 360-degree view into how VCs think, which is a little broad, but really trying to understand how you think about building a business from an arm's length. And I don't know if you would describe it that way, build it, because that takes some credit or whatever. But how
specifically, I can react very strongly to that one.
Okay, yeah. So
I don't think that works at all. I mean, that definitely works, and there are exceptions that prove the rule. That is certainly not our model.
Right. The building a business from an arm's length.
Like we are so massively oriented towards the fact that like a founder has to be like emotionally and intellectually and otherwise engaged and committed, and that attempting to puppeteer and all these words that you might start to think that it just gives me the creeps, to be honest. Like it makes me feel sick to my stomach because like of how much hard work there is to be done, and if someone's not emotionally super connected to that, and therefore everything in my view is in support of that person. And so if that's what building a business from an arm's length is just being supportive to someone, then I think that that's just really a challenge from a marketing perspective, because show me a founder that really is someone you'd want to spend time with, who wants to have their, be the client of someone building their business from an arm's length. So anyway, that's overreacting, and I'm sure that's not what's, in that kind of meant by the question. But, our view is, and part of the reason that, we can either kind of a couple times a year with people that we've gotten to know really well, help them start a company, or we have to be able to provide like service and software that that looks much more like a scaled offering, and charges, if you will, accordingly. I have a very hard time with stuff in the middle. Like either this needs to be someone that I feel like I'd invite to my wedding, almost, or someone that has like a normal looking widely distributed customer relationship. That stuff in the middle. I don't know how you do that.
How do you know then if you're supporting these businesses and you want to be very careful not to sort of step into this puppeteer position?
You don't have the choice to, but
yeah. How do you find? I'd imagine that can sometimes be a muddy distinction. Like you want to help like that caring parent or whatever, but you also don't want to be the overburdensome person.
Yeah, I think it's a big like a trust thing. I think the word we've often used for that role in particular is like is more caddy than coach. And when you think about I don't play a lot of golf, but what at least I imagine that the people are talking about on the TV when they're whispering to each other is that for the most part the golfer's golfing and making the decisions and whatever. And what are they checking in on? They're checking in on
maybe try
distance and what do you think and whatever. And every once in a while there's a moment, I assume, when the caddy walks over and the guy says, or the gal says, give me the 9-iron, or maybe that's not that, I'm going to lay up. And they say, I really think you should, pull out a bigger club here and go for it. And there are other moments where they're like, give me the, 5-iron, I'm going for it. And they say, well, hold on a second. Like, you sure you don't want to lay up? On the margin, I think like that's a lot of like what that relationship looks like. But that requires that people have developed a lot of trust over time, and that's why all the more reason why when I say like anytime we've been able to have the really good fortune to try to start a company with someone, I feel like it's because we've known them for a very long time, and gotten to know them through creating these work projects that we do together and create common ground around, and those have taken lots of different forms over the year, but that's always been pretty core, is like, how do we have something that we're working on together so that when this moment arrives that, we all understand each other, and there can be that relationship can take place in a meaningful way.
So I'm curious, in this kind of playing that role of the caddy, if an entrepreneur in residence or a founder that you're supporting comes into your office, and they've been building this business and maybe they have some traction or whatever it may be in this specific situation, and they're thinking about raising venture capital, and they want to know, like, okay, how are the VCs going to think about it? How should I be thinking about it?
Yeah.
What are you telling them in that position?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a bunch of crappy analogies that probably arrive. Like the first is, think hard about what type of vehicle you are creating, because the capital that you are going to go try to get is fuel, and you need to make sure you buy the right fuel for the vehicle you're making. You're building a Falcon 9 or whatever, you need rocket fuel, and if you're building a G5, you need jet fuel, and if you're building a Ferrari, you need whatever you put in a Ferrari.
Right.
And by the way, you could build a Ferrari, but if you put jet fuel in it, you'll fuck it up, and you'll ruin it, and that'll be really too bad, because a Ferrari was probably a pretty cool thing to have. So first of all, it's like, obvious, but like, the capital is a means to an end. It's fuel for your whatever you are driving or you're trying to push forward, and be thoughtful about, like, is this the right type of fuel? Venture capital as a form of fuel has a very specific set of characteristics to it. It is high performance in certain ways, and it is really, like, fucks up the Ferrari if it's put in the wrong place. And so that's like a part of the conversation, is like, and that's hard, right? Because rarely do you know enough about the business to know. There are some, like, kind of high level things, like, is your business zero marginal cost? Is it truly something that can scale near infinitely, given the right resources? The closer that, and software, by the way, is a business that looks a lot like that. And so the closer that, I think what you've seen through the venture cycles, the closer that a business kind of hews to that baseline dynamic, the more applicable venture capital can be. And I think what you see in the cycles is that, like, when venture capitalists are feeling aggressive and risk on, they tend to put money into things where the zero marginal cost dynamics are a little less clear, and right. Or where they're kind of squinting their eyes to something. And when they're a little bit more conservative, they start to kind of go back to their knitting.
They got
but
more
it's no
columns
surprising,
in the model.
It shouldn't probably be too surprising that venture capital and software / information technology came about at the same time. Right?
Right.
These are bedfellows, and so I think that's an important thing to kind of keep an eye on. So that's kind of one. Two is, as best as possible, to remind people that, like, they're the buyer of this resource that is capital. That's a hard thing to wrap your head around, because I think obviously you're going to go try to sell, like, so is the other person. So you've got kind of two buyers in the exchange. And
do you mean that in the sense that the VCs need to raise capital and also the founders need to raise capital?
I was going to say the VCs are buying stock in a company, so they think of themselves as a buyer, right? They think they're sitting there, I'm going to buy stock in this company. Yeah. Do I want stock in this company? If so, why? And so they're undertaking a conversation, and they would like to therefore be sold. I mean, they need to, technically speaking, be sold to. You are the seller of that stock, and so you need to explain to them why the stock is valuable. But also, at the same time, if you're an entrepreneur, you are buying a commodity, which is money. You need money. And so how are you going to buy it? You're going to issue shares in your company. Right. The more that you can have at least both sides of that equation in your mind, I think the more effective entrepreneurs tend to be in trying to figure out, well, like, from whom should I buy this money? Why am I buying it from you versus so-and-so? Is it because you're the only money available to me? If that's true and I need the money, then that's my option.
This is kind of VC founder fit.
Yeah, I guess so. Exactly. And what price am I willing to pay for that money?
Right.
And is my own estimation of, like, the value of my currency, i.e. my stock, too high or too low? Or should I pay a higher price to get higher quality money? Should I pay a higher price to get money from a person that I really like and trust, or is more aligned to me? So I think it just but bare minimum, if you take the attitude that I, as an entrepreneur, am at least like an even party in this conversation, I am buying something from you, the investor, you might ask questions like, well, like what's different about your money? Like, right. Why should I buy your money? Is your money better? It's certainly not greener or worth more, technically speaking. So it's the same from that perspective. But like oftentimes, if you then get into that conversation, it's like, well, our money's really good because we're really good at getting people to the next round.
Sure.
So if you raise seed capital from investor X, a pretty good question is like, well, what percentage of your companies have raised the next round, and what role would you say you played in that? And can I talk to a few of them? Right. Those would all be like normal questions that you'd ask if you were buying something from someone, right?
So they should be this kind of interview going both ways.
It's very hard to do. And by the way, I think most venture capitalists that you meet are really good at not because they don't want to talk about it, but because they're insatiably curious.
Right.
They want to learn about your business. So they're going to ask you questions. And frankly, you want to tell them about your business. So you're going to spend a lot of time on the conversation talking about your business. But I think it's something we definitely try to talk about, is just like think for a moment about like what could you be learning, vice versa. Obviously the more you're talking, the less you're learning, type of thing.
Is there anything, I'm sure that you probably have a lot of peers that are VCs. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you found that maybe, how do I put this, something that founders don't maybe often know or understand about the way that VCs think and are approaching it?
Yeah, I wish I could say that I had the perfect answer to that question, because I try to figure that out all the time. First of all, I think as a kind of general point, my experience with most VCs is they're extremely nice people. Yeah. They are very curious. They want to learn about your business. By the way, that sometimes comes out in like a bad behavior that is not purposeful, which is like they will keep talking to you for as long as basically you will talk to them, because on the margin it's high optionality to them.
Right. They just want information.
They want it, not because they're like, oh, I'm gonna mostly pimp this person for information that I can use, but it's because that's their business, and they're curious, and they're
probably
smart,
interested in it,
and they're interested, and they just want to learn, and so but that can create a dynamic where the entrepreneur hears that as, oh, this person asked me so many great questions. You're like, yeah, but that's their job, and they're really good at that, and they're learning a lot. So I get what they're getting out of this trade, I think a big part of it, and maybe this is less true at the kind of pre-seed, seed stage, although it's not irrelevant, is they have pitched something, to your point, they have sold someone on something. So they have sold a LP on their strategy, and they have a certain number of checks that they can write out of their fund. And they need to kind of they have some math that they've done, which is like, we're going to write this many checks, we're going to own this much of these companies, and on a representative 10 of them, we want and expect that a couple of them are going to return the fund and generate a attractive return on capital, and the rest are probably going to go to zero.
Return the fund, meaning that this is where all the returns going to come from.
The single company, it's put simply, let's say you wanted to have a fund that returned 3 times the money that came from the LP into the venture fund. By the way, that's like minimal performance, and the good ones do way better than that. But let's just say you want it 3 times. Well, more likely the way that you get to 3 times is that you have 3 out of 10 investments, let's call it, and you make 10 investments. You have 3 that return, the entire value of the fund. So your tiny investment, your 1/10 of your fund. Let's say you made only 10 investments out of a fund. Well, that means, and let's say they were evenly distributed, well, 10% of the fund goes into each of your investments. Well, if you had to get the entire value of the fund, that means that each one of those 10% stakes needs to 10x in value in order to return the value of the fund.
Right. And
then if you do that 3 times, then you get a 3 times fund, right? Because 3 of your investments have generated 10x returns, which would get you there. So, but whether that's the math, most of the time it's more than that, it's more complicated than that. But the point is, they're running a very simple analysis, and this is where often there's pretty big mismatch, which is they're just basically asking a question of, could this business 10x, or for businesses that are making even smaller, more distributed, have more bets in their portfolio, they might have to do 20x, 30x, 40x, 50x. So they're making an analysis of can this do that? that's a very high bar.
Yeah.
Like for an investment to be something that has a, for example, 10% chance of 10xing. Like if you hold yourself to that as an entrepreneur, you know,
it's a high standard.
That's not what most people, like most entrepreneurs are not going into the conversation of, does this business have a 10% chance of 10xing from here?
And a lot of great businesses, I mean,
don't
have
even,
never
don't
done
even
that.
sniff it.
Yeah,
exactly. And so I think that's a place where there's a lot of mismatch. And if you just think about how big does a business need to be? Okay, so now what did you know, like if you just take round numbers, let's say that each one of those investments was $2 million. So I have a $2 million investment through which I buy a stake in a company, and I have to turn that $2 million if I'm the investor into $20 million. So I have to 10x that thing. Well, let's say I put $2 million in. In today's market, if you're an entrepreneur like walking out the door, a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll raise $2 million on, I don't know, $10 million valuation. So that thing's going to buy me something in the range of 20%. Okay, so 20% of the company has to be worth $20 million, but it's going to be diluted. So maybe that 20% is more like, you know, worth like 15%. And so to get, you know, 20 million out of that, I'm going to have to sell the company for over $150 million or something like that. Well, again, if you think about what a business, what's required from like just a pure market dynamic to support a business, and that's small, by the way, that's the smallest end of this range you could possibly do. Most people don't buy that big a stake at that stage. Most people don't, whatever, but just play the math through. If you think about how big a market has to be to support the creation of a business, even that big, well, it has to be multiples of that because you're probably not going to capture 100% of the market. You're certainly not going to capture all the margin of that market and all these different things. And so the market, and the reason why everyone jokes about TAM and all these things, and there's a lot of, you know, technically speaking analysis done, part of it is like kind of the hand-waving, laughable analysis of early stage, you know, venture capital. But most of it is actually just like trying to think, like trying to imagine, is there enough? And because often the markets are new, so it's like, is there enough here?
Yeah.
Is there actually like a big enough
Totally.
space here to support an outcome that in turn justifies, you know, that one of my positions as an investor is going to go into a thing, and do I rate the probability that it could, you know, 10x or 20x or whatever high enough to make it work? And so anyway, that's just to say that there is math that has been sold. And so among the buying questions that you might ask to just understand it is, how many investments do you make out of this fund? What's the average position you try to acquire? What are your kind of like, you know, okay, if I do the math, that suggests
understand
that like
their
each
math.
one of these needs to 20x. So, okay, at least you're starting to like engage in a conversation that you might engage with if you were making a trade with someone, where you kind of like understand where they're coming from, and
I mean,
they
it makes
understand where you're coming from.
It makes a lot of intuitive sense. Like you want your how do I put it? Like your investor's idea of their return on investment probably shouldn't make you uncomfortable if you're taking their investment.
Yeah, at least you kind of just like know where they're coming from, and then there's obviously a version of that also, which is like rarely do they expect their expectation is that that's going to take quite a long time for you to get to that moment.
Right.
In order to get to that moment, they will probably want to or need to raise another fund before that. So now they need some intermediate term checkpoint on how you're doing in order to, even if it weren't necessary for the business, in order to understand. So they need a mark. Again, most folks aren't going to like let marks, the desire to have marks, get in the way of building a good business. Like there's nothing about this. I guess my point is that your venture capital investors are human beings who are running their own business, are nervous about their own business, have to raise their own funds. They need these data points. And so, yes, it's going to come to a place where, like, if the option on the margin is raise more money or not, for example, well, you know, raising that next bit of money has real value potentially to your investor. So you just want to kind of be, at the very least, eyes wide open about that. And by the way, most businesses that are going to achieve that level of incremental scale have to get more fuel in the tank. So there's an assumption that you're inclined towards raising the next round and the next round and the next round, because very few businesses have gone through this path and not done those things. You know, like the Zapiers of the world, which I think have raised extremely little money across very few rounds, are like, you know, 1 in a million in terms of outcomes. So that's where you go back to that fuel point, and what type of fuel are you buying, and what are the expectations that come with that fuel, and are you, you know, even just like emotionally ready that that's like the definition of success for that path.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want I want to keep asking you questions, but we're rapidly running out of time. I'm the new podcaster here. I'm like, how do I land this plane? How do I land this plane?
You got another one. You got someone else in the waiting room.
But
you're a doctor that's got to kick people out.
I hope it doesn't feel that way.
No.
I guess to kind of wrap things up, I understood that you're writing a book or releasing a book?
We are writing a book. We're somewhere in the between writing and releasing.
Okay.
Henrik and I. We've created a book called Me, My Customer, and AI. It started as a collection of essays drawn both from essays that we'd written over the past few years, as well as some new stuff that we've written as part of bringing autos more closely to market and into market. We're deciding quite where between collection of essays and like proper book we will be, and so TBD exactly the release of that, but it should be in the coming months. And it's all about this notion that at bare minimum, that if you can use AI to stay close to your customer, to talk to your customer, to create and then scale the intimacy of your customer relationships, that is at least a path for how you use AI to your benefit as an entrepreneur.
Do you know where we'll be able to find it, or is that still TBD?
We have it. I'll send you a site that you can put into your link where we have at least an initial taste of it and a place to sign up. But that's still TBD. I mean, it'll be on Amazon and everywhere.
And where else can people find you?
Well, in the spirit of emailing people, I'm Nicholas@PreHype.com, and so please feel free to email me, and I do a halfway decent job of that. And then I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn. Twitter @ThorneNY, and I don't know where I am in LinkedIn, but
awesome.
You know how to find me.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Nicholas.
I appreciate
it. Putting up with my
and thank you for this delicious bag of cold brew.
Yeah.